Jessica Fraser. I'm a lecturer at the University of Oxford.
Well, I'm Alistair McGrath and I'm the Andreas Idris Professor of Science and Religion.
I am Professor Dermot McCullough and my speciality is the history of the Church.
My name's Catherine. They call me an Associate Professor of Old Testament.
My name is Anthony Reddy. I'm the Director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture.
My name is Hindi Naiman. I'm the Royal Online Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture.
I'm Anna Sapir Abulafia, and here in Oxford I hold the chair of the study of the Abrahamic religions.
It's interesting that traditionally we can see different religions playing many different roles in society. And in fact, a lot of the big theories about the nature of religion are about seeing what those roles are. So Freud reminds us that religion can function to kind of add comfort. It can give us an answer to what the meaning of life is. It can also help people kind of formulate moral codes. And it can help kind of, in a way, it can be a psychological mechanism for dealing with our frustrations and confusions. Freud, of course, thinks this is a problem, but he admits that religion fulfills these functions. And if you look at someone like Durkheim, who's the father of sociology, he also says religion helps create a unifying, binding community. Even Marx, who's also critical of religion in many ways, says, it does indeed give people a kind of comfort. He doesn't just say it's the opium of the masses. He says it's the heart of heartless conditions, the soul of a soulless world. So all of these thinkers are acknowledging ways in which religion offers certain forms of aid to humanity. Doesn't mean that they all are necessarily seeing positive roles. They also will see negative roles in relation to society. So one of the things we do in religious studies is explore both the good and the bad, right? And look at where religion can be controlling. It can help to create problematic social forms and political ways of being. Both the positive and the negative come together in an analysis of what religion really does. And the idea is supposed to be that in the modern world, we can now help religion do a better job. You could say religion's going to go, but history doesn't show it. We still have a lot of religiosity around, and often it just changes form so that you get atheist religion, like Buddhism, for instance. But in each case, it's still playing roles, and understanding that helps us to actually shape and direct religion in the modern world. Make sure it does what we want it to do, not what we don't want it to do.
I think religious practice is very important. Now, clearly, there's huge divergence, even within a single religious tradition, on practice. But I think one of the things that religious practice is symbolizing is, to a wider cultural context, there is something about this group which marks them off. They have discovered or found something which they consider to be important, and therefore their ways of thinking and their ways of acting and gathering as communities actually reflect what it is they have found. And if you like, it is a challenge to the idea that there is only one right way of thinking. It's saying, in effect, look, you may not like it, but we're different. And it's, in effect, a challenge to a wider culture to try and find some way of coping with diversity and plurality, but still holding itself together. So if you like, we're moving into territory of how on earth we cope with diverse communities with different understandings of what is right, what is wrong, what really matters. And that has major implications for public policy. So I think it's a very important point to bring out.
What role can religious practice have in contemporary society? Well, it's hardly a question worth asking, because it's there in huge quantities. Religion is just so pervasive in human experience, and it shows no sign whatsoever of dying away. Particular forms of religious practice or observance have diminished in certain societies, particularly European societies and increasingly North American societies too. But that is a mere aspect of the wider religious practice of the world. It needs to be looked at academically, because if you don't, you're not giving any tools for understanding it, and also identifying what might be unhealthy forms of religious practice. There are always unhealthy forms of religious practice. The history of the church is just full of them. That doesn't invalidate the religious enterprise. It merely tells you things about it which you need to know and not forget.
I think the way I approach this is through the analogy, and run with me here, the analogy of the internet. So the internet can be used for many good things, a work meeting such as this, or looking up material through the Bodleian Library, or it can be used badly. So you can look up material online that's damaging. And I think the same kind of applies to religious practice. Religion can structure events, through especially through liminality, births, deaths, marriage practices. In these things, it can play a very positive role. It can provide a setting and a community, and a way of ritually organizing space. But I think it can also play a really negative role as well. Some institutions take that and want to exclude people from participation. The whole idea that about gay marriage and religion being used to sort of oppose that, and I think that is damaging. I actually did some research on marriage. So I first went to anthropology, and I found, looking at that actually there is quite a lot of variety of marriage practices. And as I understand it, anthropologists have quite a difficult time trying to define what marriage actually is. And I think that's reflected in the biblical texts. You've got marriage between a man and a woman in the Garden of Eden. You've got marriage between a man plus, so Abraham, for example, plus his wife, Sarah or Sarai, plus Pilegesh, a concubine. I'm not quite sure what this word means, but Hagar, her name literally means Ager, the definite article, the ger, so sojourner or resident alien. You've got polygamous marriage, like look at Solomon, and his many wives and so on. Then you've got marriage between a man and a female slave in Exodus, or marriage between a soldier and a prisoner of war, or a more disturbing example comes in Deuteronomy 22, where you've got marriage between a rapist and his victim. And I have looked at that in my own research, and I find that the need to actually stand up and say that this is disturbing and difficult, and that doesn't align with my own values. And I think that religious practice, especially when the biblical texts are involved, needs to take those texts seriously, and not sanitize them, but engage with them, because actually these kind of things are not just the source of some kind of antiquarian interest. These things happen today, not all of these different marriage practices, but there is sexual violence, and there are occasions where there are difficult texts, but I think the mature thing is to acknowledge them and try to understand them and talk about these things rather than shroud them in this shameful veil of taboo and silence.
I think the key thing it can do is to help us to understand each other better. And so for me, a lot of my formative understanding of this hasn't really come from my academic study. It's actually come from my formative upbringings in Bradford, in West Yorkshire. So I grew up in a post-industrial city, very, very diverse, very cosmopolitan. And people from all over the world came to work there because it's a city that grew exponentially during the Industrial Revolution. So what it needed was cheap labour, and so the labour came from all over the British Empire to work in the city. And so when I was growing up in a large comprehensive school, people from all different walks of life in terms of class and culture and religions were all in that same large state school. And what I learned from that were two things really. One was a sense of empathy. I grew up as a Christian. There was a lot of people who had no belief. There were people who were Roman Catholics, mainly white British kids. If they had any religion at all, then they tend to be Catholics. In that part of Bradford, lots of Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, people from all Jains, people from all different kind of religious traditions. And what you understood was that there's always been a close relationship between religion and culture. And obviously that's something that I study. And therefore, when you understand someone's religious perspective, you then understand something of them better. Which is not to say that there is a typical Muslim any more than there's a typical Christian. There isn't. And therefore, there's a huge amount of variation within that. So one has to be careful about not falling into stereotypes of presume that you know someone because of a particular religious tag. Actually, you don't. But on the other hand, knowing that does give you a particular insight into how their culture and their background might work. That I think is hugely important within our developing societies that are becoming more plural on the one hand. So obviously people are migrating across greater distances. Most countries are becoming more diverse than they've been in the past. And yet what we're also seeing at the same time is a kind of rise of popularism that is making us more intolerant around those differences. And therefore I think a kind of religious education in its broadest sense that just helps us not necessarily to understand all the deep beliefs that different traditions have, although that's not a bad thing, but actually just helps us to appreciate what are some of the values that help to orientate how people see their lives, how people understand themselves, actually is only for the better, given the fact that increasingly we will be more mixed as societies and not as divided as we might have been along lines of class or culture, or ethnicity, or even race, as might have been the case back in the 19th century.
So, I think there are many religious practices that can serve to exemplify the kind of peace and hope and harmony of which I spoke. It's important for me, before I give examples, to say that this is not about expectation or assumption. But I think by example, what people call blue time or downtime or getting off screens. There's this concept of Sabbath, which is away from work. And I think it's a beautiful concept which has been adopted and integrated in a current discourse. I think having that time for thinking and for therapeutically reflecting on oneself and on one's world. Another beautiful practice, and I was thinking about this because a close friend of mine just lost his grandfather. There are practices within my own tradition, within the Jewish tradition, about how to mourn. The first period of time before a body is buried, one is not obligated to do any law, any positive acts of law. One doesn't have to pray. One doesn't have to put on phylacteries, like various acts of prayer. But one is released from all of that until the period of Shiva begins, which is a week where you are surrounded by family and friends, where you're given an opportunity to reflect on the person who has died. And that's also part of an entire month, which is also a sacred month to continue to reflect and find your way back in. So that ways of dealing with and thinking about mourning, I think, is another example. Rituals of mourning, rituals of loss, and how to think about it. Not that it's a one-size-fits-all or the particularity necessarily speaks to you, but it can speak as a model for how to mourn and how to celebrate. I'll talk about a positive thing because that was such a dark example, and that's an example of love. How does one celebrate the union of partners, of marriage, of the birth of children? I think there are many ritualized expressions in the form of liturgy, in the form of practice, that are meant to exemplify for thousands of years what it is to bring someone into the world and how to celebrate that, and also how to celebrate love, which is both physical and spiritual.
I think religious practice can play, well, first of all, does play an enormous role in society, as we've already said. Personally, I don't think there's much point of going to synagogue, mosque, temple, church, whatever you go to, and think about being a good person and then being beastly to everybody else when you come out of the building. To me, that doesn't make sense. I think one of the things that being part of a religious community helps is that, and also children growing up in that kind of atmosphere, is the sense of community. And I think it's one of the great things we, of course, have in Oxford. And I think here particularly about college communities. I think these things matter. The socializing aspect, being together. And if there's one thing we've learned from the pandemic is how much we need each other, and not just looking through a screen, but we need each other as human beings in 3 dimensions.